Hi, my name is Emily Willoughby, and today I'm going to talk about an ongoing project I've been working on at the University of Minnesota in one of the longest-running studies of cognitive ability in adopted families. First, I'll go into a little background about adoption studies of cognitive ability, along with the motivation for this project. By and large, adoption studies have been showing for several decades that while adopted kids' IQs may correlate with their parents early in childhood, this relationship tends to flatten out over time. One of the best known of such studies is Scar and Weinberg's 1983 adolescent adoption study. Along with several subsequent studies, what they found is that while the correlation between offspring and mid-parent, which is the average of mother and father, remained robust for biological families, for adopted families, this relationship was almost entirely flat nearing the end of the so-called rearing period of about 18.5 years. Scar and Weinberg summed up their findings thus: "We interpret the results to mean that younger children, regardless of their genetic relatedness, resemble each other intellectually because they share a similar rearing environment. Older adolescents, on the other hand, resemble one another only if they share genes." Our interpretation is that older children escape the influences of the family and are freer to select their own environments. Parental influences are diluted by the more varied mix of adolescent experiences. Since then, many studies, both twin and adoption, have replicated the general finding that the effects of the shared environment peter out and nearly disappear over childhood and into adolescence, such as from this famous figure from Tom Bouchard, comparing the correlations of parent and adopted child IQ in childhood and showing the decline into adulthood. Passive and active gene-environment correlations can both explain this, but regardless of the reason, a decline in the shared environment over time is fairly well established for most cognitive phenotypes. When parent-offspring correlations are examined for different aspects of general cognitive ability, the pattern is similar across the different components, as it is to IQ. Here, the dashed adoption correlation settles in around 0 for verbal ability, spatial ability, speed of processing, and recognition memory. And yet, other research has nevertheless found a persistent effect of the shared environment on adopted children's IQs. In some cases, a placement effect of 7 to 10 IQ points has been found when lower ability children were placed in higher ability homes. Across the normal range of older kids, in 2015, Kendler and colleagues found what amounts to a 4.4 IQ point effect of the family environment on adopted Swedes. But we can reasonably assume that a lot of these 18 to 20-year-old kids are either still living with their parents or are at least relying on them substantially, so that the family environment would still be very close by and salient for them in everyday life. So what about truly adult offspring who have moved out of the house, completed their education, and so on? At the Minnesota Center for Twin and Family Research, we just so happen to have a very unique sample of adopted and biological families poised to answer that question. These individuals have been in our system for over 2 decades now, and they represent a total of 617 families with cognitive ability measures first taken around 1998. Of these families, 409 have at least one adopted child and 208 only biological children, for a total of around 1,200 of both parents and offspring. For adopted children, the age of placement in the home was quite young, at only about 4.7 months. For the past year, we have been reassessing these families on a number of measures, and at the moment are about 70% complete. So everything reported here is preliminary. Just as a rundown of how this project has gone, our intake assessments were conducted when the children in these families were mostly adolescents, spanning an age range of 11 to 21 with a mean age of about 15 years old. At intake, we had 1,232 total offspring. Note that throughout the subsequent follow-ups, we've had relatively low attrition rates of well under 100 for each assessment period. We are now undertaking the third follow-up, and at just over 700 so far, we're expecting to finish assessment by December. These offspring are now all between the ages of 26 and 40, with a mean age of 32. Although we're gathering a lot of really interesting data on these adult offspring, this project focuses primarily on IQ, and particularly on the vocabulary subtest scores, since cognitive ability has been a topic of ongoing interest in adoption studies. At intake, our sample's IQs were noticeably a bit above the population average, with biological and adopted offspring very similarly distributed, and with parent scores just a little bit to the right of all of the offspring scores. For full-scale IQ, parent-offspring correlations are very close to what most other samples have found for this age range, with adopted families weakly correlating but still non-zero, and biological families in the range of 0.3 to 0.4. For each component of IQ, the parent-offspring and sibling correlations are about what you'd expect for adopted versus biological, with most adopted correlations being weak but non-zero, and biological correlations in the range of 0.3 to 0.4, except for picture completion, which is unusually weak. Vocab is the subtest that we'll be focusing on most here, as it's what we have the most data on, and it's also a particularly good subtest for all sorts of things. It picks up a lot of systematic variants, both heritable and otherwise, and it tends to be one of the least noisy of the IQ subtests. Since vocab is the main subtest of interest, it's good to get a sense that our adopted and biological samples are not too different. As you can see from our intake data, they very closely overlap, much like for full-scale IQ, with parents tending to score just a bit higher. So in our current and third follow-up assessment, these adult kids once again took a vocab subtest of the Wechsler. For both bio and adopted offspring combined, their adult scores correlated with their adolescent scores at 0.55. Not bad for a 17-year gap. So now that we've established that this is a fairly reliable measure, the big question, what did the parent-offspring correlations look like after these 17 years? For biological families on the right, we see an almost identical correlation to what we saw at age 15. But the more striking thing here is that the slope for adopted families is not only not negligible, it's also not smaller than it was at age 15, which is what we would normally have predicted based on prior research. To compare the adopted correlations directly, note that our current sample of 32-year-old adopted offspring's vocab scores correlate at 0.16 with their parents, while the original correlation at age 15 was half that at 0.08. It is important to mention that these lines are not yet significantly different from one another, although finishing data collection should give us the power to detect the difference if it is there. Let's compare the size of the parent's vocab slope on the y-axis as the predictor for both types of family over time. So here's the caveat. Note that this is comparing prediction in the full sample at intake with over 1,000 total offspring to the smaller sample we've collected so far. In this case, the difference between the age 15 adopted correlation and the age 32 is quite substantial. But if we restrict the intake data to only those parents and offspring that have participated so far in the follow-up, the adoption relationship is much stronger at intake. So this is comparing the exact same people and their correlations with their parents on this vocab test over 17 years. Even though it's closer when we do this, note that it is still not smaller than the age 32 assessment prediction. I'll return to this point in a minute. We can also look at sibling correlations in our follow-up data as well, though we have to admit that so far we have too few biological sibling pairs to make much sense out of the 0.2 correlation. For our adopted sibling pairs, however, we can see a similar pattern as that to the parent-offspring pattern. The follow-up adopted sibling correlation is definitely larger than it was at intake. However, if we once again reduce the intake sample to only those that are currently present in the follow-up sample, thereby comparing individuals as they grow up over 17 years, then the restricted intake sibling correlation is closer to the follow-up correlation as well. But even when the exact same people are tracked, the vocab scores of 32-year-old offspring do not correlate with their parent scores less than they did at age 15. Nor do 32-year-old adopted sibling pairs correlate less than they did at age 15. Similar to the parent-offspring correlation, it's hard to predict whether the adopted sibling correlation will end up being significantly larger than the intake correlation. But I think that one part of the picture is clear. Not only is there a persistent correlation in adult adopted families for vocab, but it's very unlikely to be smaller than it was in childhood, contrary to prediction. It's probably obvious why this would be noteworthy if it holds up in the larger sample. Few psychological traits tend to show a substantial shared environment effect, and for those that do, this tends to attenuate into adolescence and adulthood. Since this is an unusual finding, it's worth considering some of the limitations so far, particularly the finding that the same adopted individuals we've assessed so far in adulthood also had stronger parent and sibling correlations in childhood. Is it possible that there's something particularly unusual about these parents or the rearing environments they create? One possibility is that more verbally inclined parents are more eager to participate in this kind of research. So I looked at whether the parents surveyed so far are different on any of the IQ measures than the ones that we haven't surveyed yet in this follow-up, and it turns out that they are, with mildly higher full IQ scores and substantially higher verbal IQ scores. This clarifies further when we look at the subtests, and we see that the two components of verbal IQ that we have measured in our sample, vocabulary and information, both show much bigger scores in the parents whose families have been surveyed so far compared to the ones that haven't been. And yet, this still wouldn't answer the question of why more verbally inclined parents, even if they do tend to participate in follow-up research studies more readily, also tend to have more verbally inclined adopted children. Though speculative so far, it's tempting to imagine that there are some yet unknown components to the development of verbal ability in adopted youngsters, and the question of whether this trajectory for adopted offspring from Plomin et al. 1997 might continue to creep upward over time. In summary, we found preliminary results from parent-offspring and sibling relationships indicate that influence of parental household on adopted vocab scores is not negligible and may be substantial. Moreover, the evidence so far suggests that the influence of the shared environment in adopted families has in some cases increased over time, contrary to predictions. Completing assessment and entry of the full sample's data will obviously help to clarify the meaning and interpretation of these findings. Remaining questions include things like, do other parental variables, particularly education and socioeconomic status, have an effect on the contribution to adopted offspring IQ at age 32? And thank you.